Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the show, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. And with us we have Sushil Pradhan. He's a military veteran from India, and in addition to his military background, he's also the executive director and COO at MidCat Advisory, uh, which is a certified data center, and he's a specialist on various cyber and technical issues and risk management. Um, and a consultant on Asian risk management. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss a very timely issue that's been gaining steam, but still remains a little bit unknown, especially in the United States, which is the semiconductor industry and actually its development in India. The issue has gained spotlight in since the start of the war in Ukraine, and the escalation of tensions with China, as the Biden administration, as well as some of the European countries, have sought to deny access to AI chips to China due to its dependency on that industry and its use in high-tech technologies that are thought to be a potential threat to other countries. However, there's a lot more to the story. And before we delve into this geopolitical discussion, let's talk a little bit about the broader context, starting with your interest in risk management and Asia-related issues, and then turning more towards the semiconductors themselves. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself, that would be fantastic.
Thank you so much, Irina, and it's such a pleasure being on this show. Thanks for inviting me. And as you mentioned, so I spent 22 years in the military in the Indian Army, where I dealt with various aspects of fighting vehicles and guided missiles. So obviously, technology was something that I was always interested in right from the very beginning. And after I left the Indian Army, thereafter I have been in MidCat Advisory, which is a premium risk management consulting firm. And as part of my charter for risk management, we deal with various aspects of geopolitical risk assessments. We deal with threat intelligence for our corporate clients and various such other issues. And this is something which has always fascinated me. And the current flavor is technology, data centers, Internet of Things. And since security systems and national security issues today really depend largely on various aspects of technology, that's something which I have been following very closely. And hence, I'm here with you today.
And how does the competitive climate is today, especially in Asia? Because there's a lot of talk about the rising high-tech startups all over Asia, and all sorts of competition and very business-oriented climate. Is that what you find as well?
Yes, absolutely. And as you know, almost 70% of the human population today is focused on Asia, which is a growing economy, with a young, educated population by and large. And to quote a guy called Caesar Gupta, who was with Google, who actually created the whole Google Pay ecosystem. What he said is that if you develop and make for Asia, you're making for the world. So that's how the competition in technology today is.
And where, by the way, do you see the most growth? First of all, which sector, and also which countries or parts of Asia?
So I feel that the current crisis that the COVID-19 pandemic brought about made the world realize that you have to move away from your dependency on technology in the Asian region on China.
Hmm.
So today, countries which have been satellites of China, like Vietnam, Cambodia, etc., they are also growing their technology. We have countries like India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, which have hugely booming economies. Of course, Pakistan has been slipping of late in the last few years. And then you have the area of Philippines, Indonesia, again, which have stable political systems and have young educated populations, and of course a lot of multinational companies taking interest there and growing the economy as well.
This is all very interesting because just to let you know, there's been a lot of talk in the United States of Asian pivot, and at
Yeah.
least three administrations in my memory have all made this pivot, and yet it never quite took off because, a lot of the Asian pivot was merely limited to the discussion of security issues regarding China, not so much on creating a more integrated business development climate or trade or economy or the sort of engagement, certainly people-to-people engagement on technology issues or on education and anything else that has not been part of the Asian pivot discussion under any of the administrations, Republican or Democrat, and which, as I see it, is not really makes it really a pivot. It just makes makes the discussion incomplete. And this is where I kind of want to fill in the space and to kind of understand a little bit what's going on and why, how is it that all of this has taken off and no one has noticed, and meanwhile, the global economy seems to be kind of stuck on a few narrow discussions on a few crises resulting from the pandemic, from exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, and some policy decisions. But this sort of positive kind of engagement is not really part of the focus. It's just a lot of negativity, a lot to talk about climate change, energy, not a lot about the positive things in terms of development and the opportunities and challenges that sector presents. And a small aspect of it, of course, has been a semiconductor industry, but I think not many people understand that it's big and it's important because it's on the news and that many countries are now cooperating in trying to push and advance the technology. But I don't think many people know exactly what it is. So let's start with defining our terms. What is this semiconductor industry? What are AI chips and why are they important?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And it's actually what you're saying is true, because today semiconductors have assumed the same significance in the world's economy as petroleum products. So, where we had geoeconomics driving geopolitics or vice versa, the situation keeps changing all over the world. And in Asia, it's the same story, because we want to figure out whether economics is important or politics is important, and they are closely very interdependent. But yes, coming down to the nitty gritties, and I think we should look at today in this talk on semiconductors and specifically focusing on semiconductor chips. So, just to sort of introduce the topics of what are semiconductor chips. Basically, these are small electronic devices made out of semiconductors, and there are various types. We all tend to club semiconductor chips into one bracket, but there are actually various types. So we have the memory chips, which store data and programs on computers and data storage devices. Then you have things what we call microprocessors. So they have central processing units, and these are used in personal computers, tablets, smartphones, and some of these may even have multiple CPUs, what you call. And on the other hand, mobile devices have very advanced microchips today. You also have something known as a graphic processing unit. So typically these were designed for gaming, but now we see that they are being used more and more in artificial intelligence applications, because when used in conjunction with a CPU, this GPU, or what we call the graphics processing unit, it can greatly increase the computer performance by taking some other computationally intensive functions. And this really accelerates how quickly applications can process, since the GPU can perform many calculations simultaneously. Then you also have something known as a commodity integrated circuit or commodity chips. These are simple chips used for performing repetitive processive routines. So these are in large batches, and they are used in simple applications like barcode scanners, washing machines, microwave ovens, and things like that. And these are largely dominated by the Asian semiconductor makers. You also have some ICs which are made for specific purpose. These are called application specific ICs. For example, Bitcoin mining. I'm sure all of you have heard about this. So Bitcoin mining is something which is accomplished by these ASICs that do only one function, that is mining. Then you also have something known as a field programmable gate arrays or FPGA chips, which are another type of commodities ICs that can be customized to a manufacturer's specification. So if you want to build a, let's say a MRI machine, or you want to build a military radar, you have these FPGA chips in them. And the latest which is now come around is the SoC, or the system on a chip, which is basically the newest type of chip. And all these electronic components for an entire system are built into a single chips. So you can imagine how powerful, how complicated, and of course how expensive all these are. And in a let's say like in a typical smartphone, the SoC may also integrate the graphics, camera, audio, video, everything. So here you have a multi-chip solution in a single small handheld device. And just to put the reference to the technology terminology correctly, so semiconductor technology is typically measured in generations. These are called process nodes. And it depends on the minimum feature size, or the smallest physical size possible for structures on a wafer. And these typically are measured in something known as a nanometer. So today, when we hear this terminology, the popular process nodes are 40 nanometer, 28 nanometer, 16 nanometer, 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer. So as you see, as the feature size decreases, the scope rises for the number of components as well as the quality of the performance. And today, some of the countries, the top 5 countries that produce semiconductors: China, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States. So that's the basic about semiconductors, I think.
So that raises a big question. If China is one of the top producers of these chips, why is it so dependent on other countries? For
Could you ask me that question again? Sorry.
if China is one of the top producers of that technology, why is it also so dependent on other countries for additional imports of them?
So one aspect that we must consider is that China does have a huge semiconductor processing capability of manufacturing country capability. In fact, they control a huge percentage of the world semiconductor market, but they do not have the high technology, which is the newer chips, which are the smaller 5 nanometer and the 3 nanometer chips. They have an impressive technology stack, but if they want to do 5 nanometers or 7 nanometers, they are not able to do it. And they are still dependent on Taiwan for this.
Now, getting back to the chips themselves, besides
Mhm.
all the civilian applications such as the Bitcoin mining industry and all these other things, why are they? What is their importance for in military applications? Because there is a particular concern by the U.S. at this time of escalated tensions that this advanced technology could be used in quantum computing, and there's the civilian competition, of course, but I don't think that's what is causing the concern. Competition is, normal. Countries compete, and but why is this sense of looming threat coming from China?
So defense sectors in defense equipment in many countries use very advanced equipment that relies heavily on semiconductors. And some of the devices that need semiconductors in all these devices in these systems are sensors, actuators, memory chips, electro-optical systems like vision devices. Then you have the microcontrollers, you have logic devices, you have navigation systems, and so many other kinds of applications which are used very heavily today in the semiconductor in the defense industry. And actually it's quite surprising that the not surprising, I would say it's quite illuminating to understand that semiconductors, their devices and the materials will always remain integral to the developing defense technology. And more and more wars are being fought with high technology. So if you see the current Russia and Ukraine war, you find that in people uh, terms, the numbers of people engaging in combat are not as heavy as they used to be in the earlier wars, and you have huge amount of dependence on technology, whether it's long range artillery weapons, whether it's anti-aircraft radars, anti-aircraft missile systems, drones, which are the big let's say system of warfare today being used by both sides. And it's not just in the Russia Ukraine war. You saw what happened in Armenia, you saw what happened, you're seeing what's happening in Turkey, you saw how effectively the US armed forces were using drones for standoff attacks in on terrorists in Afghanistan. So technology is going to be heavily being used in defense equipment, and this technology is very heavily dependent on various kinds of semiconductors. So obviously these two industries are very interdependent. And just to relate it to India, so if you've been following the news in Asia and in India in the last few years, India has taken on a new tagline called Atmanirbhar Bharat, which means self-dependent India in
Mm-hmm.
terms of weapon technology. And not unsurprisingly, it is being developed in parallel with the developments in the semiconductor industry, because both these industries are so interdependent and so, let's say, valuable to each other, that they can best make use of each other for furthering India's defense production, semiconductor production, and imports.
This is all very interesting, and I'll get to that point actually very, very shortly, because actually during Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US, one of the issues that was discussed was technology transfer for the first time between the US and India, and I wondered to what extent that involves any sort of semiconductor technology and what that would encompass.
Sure. So before that, let me just talk about something known
Mm-hmm.
as which was launched by India and the United States, called the Critical and Emerging Technology Initiative, or what they call the ICET, which is basically cooperation between the two countries for semiconductors. And this is where these strategic alliances come into play. So through the ICET, India has entered into a public-private collaboration in the chip ecosystem with the US Semiconductor Industry Association, or the SIA, and whose goals are to elevate India's presence in the global chip industry. The question is whether this ICT will facilitate India's quest to become a chip powerhouse, and if it does, what is at stake. So, firstly, China is obviously the big elephant in the room. The US goal for exploiting the Indian market is to lessen that effect, or failing that, at least to emulate China's influence in the global chip supply chain. While India has a very functional semiconductor talent pipeline and future expansion opportunities, there are some challenges such as raw materials, water, electricity, and most of these necessarily required metals and alloys are also controlled by China. So countering China's hegemony in such a critical industry may not be easy for India, but hand in hand with US, I think there will be a story to work out. Secondly, there are some concerns over the US game plan. Obviously, it's a undeniable reliability reality that India has a pivotal role in the US attaining its objectives in the region. But to rope in India, on one hand, it has to cater for what India wants. On the other hand, it also has to promote an India that puts the agenda that puts India as part of friend shoring. And then subsequently, at least to some extent, if not fully, India can become a supply chain alternative for them to China in the field of semiconductors. And what is a little bit unique is that India's policy of strategic autonomy, where we say that, okay, there are no permanent alliances, we have partnerships for everything. So obviously, neither India will fully commit to the geostrategic approach of the US towards China and Russia, and to what extent US will share its advanced technology and defense systems with India is also debatable. At this point, I think what the US would like to do is exploit India's well-educated yet cheap labor force, um, since the manufacture of semiconductors does require skilled engineers in large numbers. But coming back to your point about how this recent discussions, when the Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, visited the US, what transpired? What are the new initiatives in the field of semiconductors that have come about? Um, there are some significant outcomes expected in the coming years. So one of the things that was confirmed is that Micron Technology will spend more than $800 million on a new semiconductor assembly plant and test plant in India, with funding from the Indian Semiconductor Mission over the next 5 years. They say that this company will employ a workforce of 5,000 people and create an additional 15,000 community jobs over the same time period. And these products by Micron will not just be used for local consumption, they'll also be used for global consumption, thereby reducing imports and increasing exports. And this plant has actually been approved under the Indian government's modified assembly testing, marketing, and packaging scheme. These are basically companies which take the chips and package them for applications. Then there is another initiative which has been announced, which is by a company called Applied Materials, that they will also establish a semiconductor center for commercialization and innovation in India, more from the design perspective to diversify the country's supply chains. They are also talking of an incremental investment of $400 million over the next 4 years. And here the focus will be on accelerating the innovation and commercialization of the technologies which are required to produce next generation subsystems and components in India. Then another company called Lam Research. Now, these companies that I'm naming are the top few semiconductor industries from the US. They will train 60,000 engineers as part of its Semiverse solution to help the country meet its semiconductor education and workforce development. So Lam Research is a global supplier of innovative silicon wafer fabrication equipment and services for the semiconductor industry. And obviously the Indian government and the US government expect that the first pilot project related to education and skilling the Indian youth will start very soon, and they are projecting maybe as early as August this year. So these are some of the outcomes of the recent visit, and these were some of the discussions which were conducted. In fact, I think in a couple of days' time, the MOU between Micron Industries and the state government of Gujarat, where this industry is likely to be set up, is going to be signed very soon. So I think things are really looking up.
It sounds like a very practical and actually fast-paced uh, engagement, which is a very welcome change from the previous um, years of discussions that did not result in any significant changes. But going back to the chips, and one point that you raised earlier, their importance in navigation systems. The reason I'm
Right.
bringing them up is twofold. One is the growing concern about the China's naval forces and how that could impact potential tensions in the South China Sea, and speculation about possible invasion of Taiwan or incursions against other countries. The other one is the BRI project, which everyone thinks is just an infrastructural development project, but it also encompasses a lot of Space Force application, telecommunications, and other integrated civilian technologies that nevertheless in their totality could be used for military purposes. And we've seen that in Africa, in Latin America, next door to the United States, and other places. To what extent would semiconductor chips play a role in all these specific concerns that aren't really being quite discussed in that level of detail?
Right. So as you said that semiconductors are going to be very critical to the geopolitical situation and the geopolitical developments in the world. And they say today that semiconductors have become the geopolitical, economic, and the technological battlegrounds between nations. So, what is the significance or the geopolitical significance of semiconductors? Why is it so? What the first is obviously technological advancements, because semiconductors enable the development of cutting edge technology like artificial intelligence, 5G telecom, Internet of Things, defense equipment, like you mentioned, things like even as as diverse as autonomous vehicles. And obviously nations with advanced semiconductor technologies gain a competitive edge in driving innovation and fostering their economic growth. For example, if you've seen, Apple has just come out with its new virtual reality, augmented reality headset, which is supposed to be absolutely path breaking and revolutionary. So till such time the competition catches up, they are going to be the market leaders at least for the next 2 to 3 years, as I see. And because they have created the technology and the hardware, the software developers are also going to sort of piggyback on this hardware and get into developing software for this kind of hardware. The next is obviously the national security considerations, because semiconductors play a vital role in defense systems, communication infrastructure, cybersecurity. And recognizing this, countries have started prioritizing the security of their supply chains for semiconductors to protect the national security interests. The third aspect of geopolitics of semiconductors is the supply chain dependency, because the global semiconductor supply chain is really complex and interdependent. And just relying on a few countries for semiconductor production and supply creates huge vulnerabilities, since any disruption or geopolitical tension can impact global industries and economies. So as the global industry of semiconductors becomes increasingly critical, countries are not only going to focus on refining their own technologies, but also restricting access to perceived adversaries. So, for example, the US had just used earlier the foreign direct product rule to ban Huawei's exports to their country and to cut off the chip supply to Russia as well. And recently, they have created something known as the CHIPS Act, which, as you would be aware, stand for the creating helpful incentives to produce semiconductors, which is a huge 52 billion semiconductor manufacturing incentive plan proposed by the US government. And basically it seeks to provide significant financial incentives to US chip makers to encourage domestic production so that they can reduce their dependence on imports, especially from China, and to ensure a stable and secure supply of semiconductors for national security purposes. So this also has a provision that restricts the export of chips or any product in the semiconductor supply chain which is made using American technology from being exported to China, as parts of the efforts to protect the US intellectual property and national security. And obviously this has been a source of contention with India, China and others, saying that this unfairly restricts access to critical technologies. But so today we are actually witnessing what we would call chip wars, to put it in a very loose terminology, where a lot of geopolitical tensions and uh, strategies are being made around how to make certain technology accessible and how to restrict the import and export of certain technologies. So I think that's where we are today.
So that brings us to the question about what are the vulnerabilities with these supply chains? Have there been any significant issues that are cause for concern? I know that there's been an effort to bring together several countries, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and others, into an alliance to protect from future interference, from future dependency. But what are the concerns now? Have there been attempted disruptions? Whether caused by the pandemic and other practical issues, or whether caused by outside interference.
Uh, so before we go to actually what are the vulnerabilities of the supply chain, we must understand what is actually the semiconductor supply chain, which is basically a very complicated network of companies, organizations, individuals who are involved in the design, the manufacturing, the testing, the packaging and distribution of semiconductors. So first we have companies which are also known as the fabless companies. Fabless is fabrication less companies, which do pure design and development of new chips either in-house or through collaborations with other companies. And they are called fabless because they don't actually manufacture or fabricate the chips that they design and market. And approximately 90% of semiconductor companies actually operate under the fabless model, and they focus exclusively on designs while they outsource the manufacturing to specialized fabrication companies. So the second part of the supply chain is the fabrication, where the actual manufacturing of the supply chain is done by specialized factories called foundries. They get the designs from the fabless companies and they use customized equipment to create and etch chips onto silicon wafers. So if you are aware, one of the major producers of this very high tech equipment called lithography equipment is a company called ASML. And virtually 90% of the semiconductor fabrication is made on machines produced by this company itself. So obviously there has been a lot of pressure on this company also to restrict the supply of their lithography equipment to countries like China. Then we come after fabrication, you come to testing and assembly. They need to be tested, the chips, and then they are packaged into various semiconductor ICs. And the companies which are doing this, they are known as the OSAT companies, the outsourced semiconductor assembly and test companies. And typically they take the wafers and bare dies, which are the untested semiconductor chips, and package them into final products that can be used in electronic devices. But now that we've got these chips ready, they need to be distributed. So the packaged chips are distributed to companies which will sell them to end users or incorporate them into their own products or directly through various distributors. So all of this requires extensive logistics and supply chain management, which requires inventory management, order fulfillment, transportation, and efficient logistics and supply chain management are really critical. So what are the vulnerabilities in this? One is, of course, for example, uh, any disruption in this supply chain can have ripple effects throughout the entire system. In 2011, there was a major earthquake and a tsunami in Japan, which disrupted the global supply chain for semiconductors, which led to huge shortages and very sharp price increases. Then, of course, in recent memory, we have the most significant disruption to the semiconductor supply chain, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. This caused lockdowns, disruption to global shipping and logistics. The lockdowns caused worker shortage, and companies at all stages were forced to reduce their capacity or temporarily shut down. And this led to shortage of chips in many industries. For example, car manufacturers. They were really hurt by these disruptions, which had the knock-on effect of creating a shortage of new cars, and consequently drove up the price of used cars to record levels. And another factor which contributes to the vulnerability of this semiconductor supply chain is the concentration of manufacturing in a very few key regions, like we discussed, particularly in Asia. So this is Taiwan, China, South Korea. And this concentration has really made the supply chain susceptible to geopolitical tensions or trade disputes also, which can disrupt the flow of materials and components. For example, the US has recently placed trade restrictions on Chinese semiconductors on the companies to prevent them from stealing the designs of the West's most advanced chips, which have very extensive military and advanced AI applications. Then we also have semiconductor supply chain experiencing shortages due to internal factors such as manufacturing capacity constraints, changes in demand, because the industry is characterized by long lead times and high capital investment. So whenever there is a excess of demand, it can take months or even years for the semiconductor manufacturers to build new factories and ramp up the production to meet the increased demand. So this is something that happened initially in the cell phone market, then it happened in the let's say wearable devices market, and it's happening today in the defense sector. So uh, how do you deal with all of this? Various steps can be undertaken, but they are not easy to implement, and nor are they cheap. So what governments can help to do in some cases is to defray some of these costs by offering incentives and tax breaks. And they can even help in the coordination of establishment of new domestic production facilities. Just to put things in the correct perspective, even the massive chip industry in Taiwan came up only because of assistance from the government. It wasn't a completely private sector issue. And China, as you know, a lot of the businesses today are being funded, supported by the governments themselves, and that's why the US has also stepped in with the chip act, and that's what India is going to do. So for example, in the US recently, Intel has created two new foundries, which is a 220 billion investment along with a very advanced packaging facility in New Mexico. Micron has also made a 15 billion dollar investment to add new fabrication facilities in the US. Global Foundries, Samsung Foundry, Texas Instruments, Taiwan Semiconductors, they are all building new fabs in the US due to these efforts. In addition to the actual material part of it, there's a consulting firm, Deloitte. They warned by 2030, more than 1 million additional skilled workers are going to be required to meet the demand in the semiconductor industry. And to preempt a supply chain disruption caused by talent shortfall, they are advocating that countries must build new talent pools in new locations, leverage educational and community partnerships, for example, like India.
So in India, clearly there's a very growing need in every area because it has a huge population and it's also been rapidly developing. At the same time, there's an economic boom, which means there's more need for semiconductors. But can you tell us exactly what that means for the country and what it means in terms of actually streamlining the students and young professionals into those industries? How, to what extent is that something that is manageable even? And
Yeah, that's a really good question. To start with, I think there is no denying the fact that semiconductors today are really critical for India. And like we said, the global economy is going to be more and more dependent on the regular and uninterrupted supply of semiconductor chips. The same is for India. Just to put things in perspective, in 2020, India spent $15 billion on electronics imports, with 37% of them coming from China. And any country which lacks the capability to manufacture semiconductors domestically with such a huge consumption, they are going to be at the mercy of suppliers from such countries. And since India receives most of its chip supplies from Taiwan and China, considering the current status of the tense Sino-Indian bilateral relations, India could be subjected to sanctions in terms of supply of semiconductors. And that's why it's very important for us to speed up our semiconductor fabrication plans for execution. COVID-19 itself taught a big lesson to many developed countries, and of course to India also, that they must reduce their dependence on China and Taiwan for the supply of such critical high-tech components and semiconductor chips. For example, 21-22, due to the COVID-19 chip shortage, the Indian automobile industry was amongst the worst affected. The production of laptops, smart TVs, and other electronics products were also badly affected, and common people were impacted by these shortages. The changed geopolitical environment has further added to the concern of industrialized countries, since they fear that China may use these as weapons of economic coercion during undeclared war. And there are fears that in case China invades and takes control of Taiwan, the supply of chips might come just to a standstill, or China may not allow the export of semiconductor supplies to rival countries. So I think there is no option but for India to start developing its own semiconductor production. Today, we are importing about 80% of our required semiconductors, and any failure to develop this industry can add almost 95 to 100 billion to the country's import bill and further widen its current account deficit. So coming back to people, creating a robust semiconductor industry in India will also offer significant job creation opportunities. So today the Indian IT industry globally contributes to about 150 billion of the world's $1 trillion global IT market, and provides almost 5.8 million high quality jobs in the country, which is approximately 1/5 of the world's um, semiconductor design engineers are from India, working for multinational design companies based out of India. And uh, there are projections which say that the global semiconductor market is going to reach 1 trillion by 2030. And India's semiconductor market is also forecast to grow from 15 billion to 110 billion by 2030. This is going to put it amongst the world's fastest growing semiconductor market. And to put just these numbers in perspective, the Indian government's estimated budget for the sector in 2023 is 550 billion. If all these numbers are confusing, it just goes to say that the requirement is huge. And if we fail to develop our advanced semiconductor design and manufacturing capability, we will have to continue depending on this technology for players and companies from outside the country. So even companies like TSMC, which is the top ranked semiconductor manufacturer, generates more revenue than the combined revenue of the next 10 fabs. So currently geopolitical alignments are favorable to India, and I think India needs to take advantage of these.
what impact do you think it will have in the region should India start moving away from its trade with the China and Taiwan, and the percentage of the dependency becomes reduced? How would they compensate for this loss, and how do you see that basically shaping the regional economics and politics?
Well, so like I mentioned, the whole process of designing, creating these foundries for fabrication can take up to 4 to 5 years, but at least the process has started. So, which is a
Mhm.
very positive step. The government has announced something known as performance linked initiatives to companies, which basically tells them that the more you produce, the more incentives will give you. And the India Semiconductor Mission, what they've launched recently, also provides huge amount of funding to companies, which different amounts and different levels of fundings for different categories of production, depending on, like I said, the nodes, whether it's a 50 nanometer chip or a smaller chip. So different levels of production have got different levels of funding. But to come back to your question, I think it's not going to be easy to pull away from Taiwan and China so soon. But some of the things that we can do is, one is to actually grow together with Taiwan, um, because India is recognized as a semiconductor design powerhouse. It can benefit by TSMC setting up fabrication units in India to meet the global demand. We can do R&D, we can do semiconductor IC design, we can do assembly, testing, and packaging. And two important steps that India must really do to keep this supply chain through Taiwan afloat is quickly finalize a free trade agreement with Taiwan, and secondly set up manufacturing hubs in India, which take the expertise of Taiwanese companies and their desire to shift offshore. So Taiwan is setting up, TSMC setting up fabrication units in US. Why not in India? So India has the technology, India has the talent pool, and what it needs to develop is the resources. So I think that is where the crunch issue is going to come up. Another way, of course, is like we already discussed, is not alliance but partnership with the US, because US is houses some of the major technology and semiconductor development companies in the world, and they are willing to partner with Indian companies. They are willing to partner with the Indian government. They are putting aside funds for this. The third um, sort of grouping, a regional grouping, which we should consider is the Quad, which is a really powerful entity today in economics. So, as you know, the Quad consists of four countries: Australia, Japan, India, and the US. And they have expertise in specific domains of chip supply, and they can work together because they have complementary strengths. And if you're going to ensure that amongst these four countries you have enough redundancy and have enough collective expertise in every part of the supply chain, all four of them can actually reduce their dependency on China for chips. Let's say, for example, US is the undisputed leader in design companies, but manufacturing is tough in US as the costs are prohibitively high. Japan has the strength in the materials that go into semiconductor manufacturing. There are very specific gases that you need for etching. You need various materials, you need chemicals which have very high level of purity and precision, and there are two of three of these companies in Japan which have perfected that. Australia can supply the raw material like silica, gallium, indium, and these are elements that you need during the manufacturing of semiconductors. And where are these semiconductors going to be used? Let's say in electric vehicles. Australia is doing a lot of work on that. And where is India's competitive edge in this Quad is talent. Even if the US introduces the Chips and Science Act, they don't have enough engineers to execute many of the investments. Who's going to do the work? They are always worried that Chinese talent moving to the US will face more scrutiny because of geopolitical tensions. They are also slightly aware and worried about Chinese engineers stealing technology for China. So possibly it's going to be Indian talent which will be used, and India has the cost advantage. Companies that want to do assembly, we can do that quickly at lower costs. So I think the Quad has already got established working groups such as the Critical and Emerging Technology Working Group, which has identified areas such as semiconductors, biotechnology, 5G communications, space, cybersecurity for collaboration. And we should also note that India is going to be hosting the next Quad Summit in 2024. So I think that's one place where India can take and create a lot of advantages in the semiconductor industry and help to pull away from this dependence on China.
So while India is working out all these issues, and it sounds like there is still a lot of work to do, what is the
Mhm.
status of China and Taiwan with respect to this issue? I know you mentioned that they're some of the leaders in the region. But has this situation changed since the start of the recent tensions and policies by the US and others?
Definitely. So, as we discussed, more than 90% of the really advanced chips. Initially, I told you about the various kinds of chips, and the most advanced ones are made in Taiwan. And foundries in Taiwan do the contract manufacturing of chips for all the global semiconductor giants. The worsening relation between these two countries mean that governments and companies both, we can no longer sort of ignore the implications of a Chinese economic blockade or a military takeover of Taiwan. And which is why there is so much concern about offshoring the manufacture from Taiwan to other parts of the world within US itself, say for example in India. And I don't think this tension between between China and Taiwan is going to go away in a hurry, because uh, of economic issues as well as the expansionist programs of China. The Communist Party of China has made it part of its agenda that they will reclaim Taiwan as part of its unified China policy. So they may not actually invade, occupy Taiwan, but there will be continued geopolitical and military tension between the two countries. And the rest of the world can't afford to have a blockade on the semiconductor chips which are coming out of Taiwan and China both.
Now, there's been recent reports stipulating that China, which has previously suffered from the blockade of from the blocking of the AI chips from the US and Taiwan, has actually started importing less than previously and has actually ramped up its breakthroughs and developments in more advanced AI chips. How accurate is that, and how are they able to make these breakthroughs if previously they had to basically rely on intellectual property from other countries? How have they managed, if that is even accurate?
So there are, of course, there are various conspiracy theories, but there are also proven involvement of Chinese scientists where they've gone and worked in countries like the US, in other parts of the West. They've gone and worked in Taiwan. They've gone and worked in Japan, where very high cutting edge technology is being developed. Taken this technology and brought it back to China, and this has been supposedly sponsored by the governments there. So I think this is one of the reasons why the US has also instated the CHIPS Act, where they're saying that, okay, we will not take engineers from China. We will not allow export of very high technology chips to China. These are some of the concerns which are being expressed by most of the countries. And that's why they are willing to diversify into other countries, possibly like India.
To what extent has there been any cooperation between China and India on the scientific and research end of the chip production? Has there been any?
Not really. I don't think so. We have initiated, like I said, various kinds of understandings and initiatives with, let's say, Taiwan, with the US, with the Quad countries. But I do not think this is going to happen in the near future as well, because of the current status of our bilateral relations. There is a atmosphere of mistrust between the two. So I don't think there will be too much of a technology cooperation, but we are still dependent and we are still buying chips from China, and that's, like I said, that's not going to go away in a hurry unless we find an alternate source, which I don't visualize in the near future. Because while Taiwan and South Korea, see, South Korea chip production is very specialized for its own industries, so their own mobile phones, their own high technology medical equipment, their own high technology manufacturing. So it's very specific to their equipment. What Taiwan produces is very high level advanced chips. What China produces, some of the problems with these chip facilities is that they tend to be captive units of large companies. So we say that, okay, India, Foxconn has huge assembly facilities. They are creating jobs and inviting investment into India. But some of the most valuable facilities they are building only Apple devices, which is actually a fraction of the handsets being sold in India. And uh, I think it'll take some time for India to move away from dependence on these countries and to develop its own ecosystem.
You also mentioned other challenges, such as access to sufficient quantities of raw materials, water, and electricity, which fall within larger, larger interests and concerns for India as well. Where do you expect to find the sort of cooperation that will enable to make breakthroughs in these areas to access?
Right. So, of course, one of the issues that the Indian marketplace showed to the semiconductor industry earlier was the lack of a focused policy. Now, at least that seems to be coming on track. But there are other issues. For example, currently the Foxconn plant which is being built up in the state of Gujarat with the Vedanta, officials in the other state of Maharashtra saying that they relocated their plant from Maharashtra because of political pressure. While some level of political maneuvering is always expected on major projects, the kind of inconsistent stance of officials on various aspects of tax, they've sort of reduced the attractiveness of semiconductor manufacturers across the world, and also requires huge amount of investment. But coming to your aspect of resources, so some of the important things that are required for manufacturing semiconductors are the raw materials themselves, that is the semiconductor materials, water, and energy. China actually controls many of the metals and alloys needed for this, so India will either need to import these critical materials or invest in its own mining industry. So while we do hold about 5 to 6% of the world's rare earth reserves, which are critical to the production of semiconductors, and Indian companies have always been pushing for the government to take advantage of this fact. But expanding this industry will also take considerable time and financial investment to keep up the demand from the electronics industry. Water and energy are the other two critical resources, and India already does not have enough of either of them. Some of the reports indicate that almost 6% of India's population lack access to safe drinking water. So there is a water pressure on the population, and adding semiconductor factories which can use large amounts of water per day, which is equivalent of supplying water supply to almost 300,000 households. To mix this will further strain the supplies. There is a push by the Indian government in improving groundwater management, but not very clear how and how quickly these initiatives will succeed. Again, production of materials at India's established electronics manufacturers has also been plagued by power outages and coal shortages in the last year. We have been working to increase adoption of renewable energy to expand India's power grid. But again, how much will that ease the load on the power grid remains to be seen. So creating a viable semiconductor ecosystem is not simple. The world's current chip powerhouses also took decades to develop a mature industry. And without a robust policy framework to simultaneously address all these issues, India cannot very easily succeed in its mission of becoming a global semiconductor powerhouse.
Well, you've mentioned the various government incentives that are coming together to encourage this phenomenon. But what about the private business climate? And have there been some shifts in that respect?
Yes. So despite the impressive strides by India in improving its ease of doing business ranking, the perception is that there are significant bottlenecks to conducting business operations in India.
Mhm.
And probably a large part of this is because the last avatar of the policy was introduced almost 10 years ago. And at that time, the stakeholders' perception of the semiconductor industry was very hazy. So there's going to be a lot of work to be done to change that perception. One of these would be to streamline the structure of the India semiconductor mission. Now, this is a very much publicized and loudly announced mission. It is housed as an independent division, but it's within the Digital India Corporation. So although the DIC is a non-profit company, its chairmanship is held by the Union Cabinet Minister for Electronics and IT. So which means that basically this ISM is eventually accountable to the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. So it's not completely private, it's not completely fair play. Again, The trade policy stance is also important. So while we say that, okay, we have performance linked initiatives and the mobile telephone industry has really grown, it has been pointed out by various trade groups that how many more products would have been exported had we got an even more liberal trade regime. That is something which the semiconductor industry needs to consider. In addition, India reconsidered in 2022 its moratorium on imposing custom duties on some of the items which were covered under the World Trade Organization's 1998 declaration. So this may also work against India. We do have 20% of the global workforce that designs chips, with foreign corporations owning the IP or the intellectual property which underlies these chip designs. This phenomena of India-based research and development labs creating IP for a global marketplace is pervasive throughout the larger Indian economy as well. So, a recent estimate puts the approximate percentage of these patents which were generated by the R&D centers of India's multinational corporations between 55 to 60% of the total patents granted by the Indian Patent Registry. However, the presence of this R&D labs has not been accompanied by commercial chip fabrication. So we are designing in India high-tech chips which are being manufactured outside India, and how much is India gaining out of this is not yet very clear. So what is perceived as a robust market lack has been the persistent reason why some of the MNCs have limited their presence to R&D activity, and this is mostly repatriated back to their home countries. Supply chains are very sticky and they are not going to relocate on accounts of subsidies. Some of these subsidies are government controlled, or rather most of them are government controlled, and who says that government subsidies cannot be withdrawn at a moment's notice? So what needs to be done is creating large clusters which can support manufacturing and supply and sustain long-term operations. Now whether companies will actually commit to bringing these technologies will also depend upon various factors like business climate, domestic market, export potential, infrastructure, talent. So while India does have the theoretical base to impart semiconductor training, it also needs to make these people industry ready and connect them to the prospective employers. One more thing which sort of hinders the growth of industries and will also impinge upon semiconductor industry in India is land acquisition. It's a very time consuming and an expensive process. So, and sometimes it gets stuck in litigation. So fortunately, some of the state governments have started pooling land and making them available to investors to make their factories. And if you see, even China's semiconductor manufacturing, when it started growing, was basically spurred by huge state government subsidies, state-driven subsidies of acquisition of land and all that. So friendshoring is a great concept for some of the multinational companies and foreign governments. But in India, to make things work is going to take time, a lot of policy support, and ultimately, if somebody is investing money in manufacturing in India, they must see a positive and a fruitful outcome of that. So I think we need to do a lot of work, but we are on the way there somewhere.
What kind of support can, first of all, foreign companies, and second, governments like the United States can provide to speed up these overcoming these challenges, to debureaucratize and to create this sort of environment where entrepreneurship is encouraged and fast-tracked?
So one is, of course, money, investment, but investment will happen only when there is a view of positive outcomes from there. Second is technology transfer. So if you say that, okay, manufacture, if a country X says, here's a factory in India, why don't you manufacture chips from me? Unless they give that technology transfer, which will enable the Indian companies to use that technology to make semiconductors which can be used for multiple applications, they may not take it. They may not really take it and be. It may not be very helpful to them. For example, like I mentioned, a plant being set up for chip manufacture only for a specific telephone company. And the third thing is, of course, talent development. So they need to invest, and they need to, like I said, we have talent, we have engineering colleges which produce software engineers, hardware engineers, but they need to be connected to the global job market. Otherwise, it's not going to succeed.
And that leads me, speaking of global issues, that leads me to another question, which is much as we have heard recently about positive changes in India, a lot of it has been about overhauling the retail sector, digitalizing the economy. There's also been a lot of global talks, not just in India, but everywhere about AI, and there's been a lot of hype, and nobody really knows what's going on. Everyone talks about ChatGPT, but or the robots taking over the world, but I am not really sure that anyone really understands any of it.
Of course. So AI definitely is the new buzzword. It's the new sort of, if I were to put it, the sexy part of electronics. But we must remember that AI depends not just on software; it also depends a lot on hardware, and that's why I want to connect AI to the semiconductor industry, because of course it's been one of the most transformative technologies of the 21st century, and it's going to really revolutionize the way we live and work in the years to come. Impact is of AI is being felt across industries and sectors, whether it's healthcare, finance, education, transportation, manufacturing, everything. Most of the popular discourse around artificial intelligence has been focused on software applications. We should not lose sight of the fact that it depends a lot on the hardware, that is the infrastructure which is used for computing the artificial intelligence and its functions. And like I mentioned earlier, some of the kind of chips that it uses are the field programmable gate arrays, the FPGAs, the graphics processing units, and the very application specific integrated circuitry. These are complicated to develop, expensive to manufacture, and um, semiconductors are building next generation acceleration architectures which need more speed, more computational efficiency, more data handling, and all of this specialized AI hardware can really supercharge the AI race by serving as a differentiator in AI applications. In fact, they say that AI related semiconductors are set to grow at 18% over the next few years, as opposed to the 22% projected growth for non AI ones. And by 2025, they say that it can account for almost 20% of the total demand for semiconductor chips. So this shift in demand from general purpose to AI specialized chipsets is making new opportunities in the semiconductor market. So strategic sectors like defense, space, telecommunications, they are also going to employ more and more custom AI specialized hardware. So I think one of there are two types of hardware or chips used in AI also. One is the uh, inference chipsets. I don't want to go into the technology, but there are two types called the inference chipsets and the training chipsets. And the inference chipsets are low cost and they don't require too much technology, too much IP, and too much manufacturing capacity. So this is one place where India can also build its semiconductor um, infrastructure. And to circumvent the proprietary ownership, the government can also fund and source some open source projects to design AI hardware. There is already one called Aryabhat, which is being produced by the Indian Institute of Science. Then we also need to have some of these design linked incentives for the semiconductor industry, which must expand to include AI hardware. And of course, technology collaboration with US or the Quad will definitely help in development of AI hardware. So I think that's a good question you put, that AI is the new generation technology. AI needs more complicated and let's say efficient hardware, and this is one place where we can jump into, but requires huge amount of effort in terms of talent, in terms of R&D, in terms of manufacturing facilities.
Well, as we have seen from this very fascinating conversation, there's a lot of both opportunities and challenges, and understanding them is the first step to actually making progress. We've seen a lot of media about India, its role, the Prime Minister Modi's visit, and a lot of it has been ranging between either overly optimistic, as in will India become a superconductor superpower tomorrow, or extremely pessimistic, saying, oh, well, the bureaucracy is so terrible that they'll never catch up to China. I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. It sounds like it will take a while to overcome these challenges, but they have been tracked, they are visible, and I think there are pathways to breaking through. The issue is pushing for more cooperation, pushing to overcome them with specific plans and action, and getting past what used to be a major stumbling blocks, because it is so necessary, it is so vital, and the prospects are very promising if it's done appropriately. And I think it's slowly being turned in a positive direction. The Quad, the recent visit, the technology transfer agreements, they're at the very least a starting point to discussions, and hopefully we will see a lot more of it. And the key to all of this is, of course, consistency. Occasional breakthroughs are great. Very positive meetings, high-level meetings are wonderful, but consistency in everyday action is going to be the key to overcoming these challenges and implementing the very positive opportunities that we heard about today. Thank you so much for this amazing discussion, and I hope it clarifies a lot for a lot of people, because it's a little bit of a mystery. It's a sexy topic, but it's also, I think, things that people, don't really know much about, and therefore imagination often takes place of knowledge and understanding, and therefore some of the discussion is not, if you are either overly, if you expect too much or too little, then you're not going to do the work that's necessary to actually make it happen. That's the danger here. I hope this conversation kind of helps put those aside and focus on practical matters. And thank you again for joining us. For those watching the show, we'll be back next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as always. And thank you for watching the program with us today. Have a good night.
Thank you so much, Irina. And I'd just like to close with the comment from my side. You know that uh, none of the semiconductor superpowers today, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's China, whether it's Japan, South Korea, US, they haven't developed overnight. It has taken them years of effort, policies, money, technology to reach there. So I think we are on the way to moving towards that side. We did not have the money. We are developing economically now, so we'll be able to put more money into developing. We always had the talent. I think with the right direction we'll be able to do more. And most important is of course the policy. So the government is focused on developing the semiconductor industry. So the combination of finances, talent, and willpower will help us reach there. And I'm sure in years to come India will emerge as, maybe not as a superpower in semiconductor technology, but definitely a power which is worth recognizable.
Thank you so much. And on that positive note, I hope that everyone here not only watches this, but continues learning more about these issues. And if you are in the business world, if you are involved in the industries, this is the opportunity to get involved and contribute something positive. And I hope to revisit this topic in the near future as the situation develops and hopefully progresses. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Irina.